my last week. See if I can get everything done today that I want to get done. I want to tie up some loose ends today. And so I'm going to start with this slide. Last week I was telling you the story of how I gave a presentation at the library, and afterwards someone wrote a rather critical review of my presentation. And then I wrote a letter about the review, sort of going through the review. I did two main things in that response that I had. I reviewed the entire presentation so as to, basically I got the opportunity to give the presentation again to the person. And also I asked them a lot of questions, and I did that on purpose. I wanted to get across to them that they didn't try to answer my questions. They didn't answer my questions, and I don't think they were able to answer my questions. And I think it's really, really important that we ask questions to people. I'll come back and talk to that a little bit later. As I was reading through my letter, one of the things talked about, I don't know if you caught this at all, but there was something that talked about somebody shooting a car. So I wanted to start with that today. A random change is not likely to improve the genome any more than blindly firing a gunshot through the hood of a car is likely to improve engine performance. This random change here, this is talking about mutations. This is in a college-level biology textbook. The next line says this: on rare occasions, however. And then they proceed to pretty much contradict what they just said. When I presented this in my presentation, I was living out in the country, and I remember saying, I live out in the country, and I'm willing to perform a scientific experiment. If you'll drive your car out to where I live, I'm willing to shoot some bullet holes through the hood of your car, and we can do an experiment, and we can find out if this will improve your engine performance. No one took me up on that. No surprise there. Nobody would actually do this, right? And actually expect that they would get some kind of improvement in the engine performance. On April 15th, 2005, John McGinley of Broward County, Florida, shot his 1994 Chrysler LeBaron 5 times in the front hood. The report from the sheriff's office listed the Chrysler as deceased. That's our experience. We all know that that's what would happen, and yet they would write something like that in a biology textbook and pretend like somehow that's scientific, and it's really not. I was reading through an article that was written by an evolutionist, and in that article he made this statement, so that's why it's in quotes. Creationists need to show that mutations in natural selection are insufficient for evolution to occur. That is completely wrong. What this person has tried to do is change the burden of proof from himself and place it onto us. In fact, it's very difficult to prove a negative, and that's what he's asking here. But that's not the way this should work, and I want to make sure that you understand the burden of proof needs to be on them. The evolutionists are the ones that are making these amazing, almost ridiculous claims, and they don't have experimental evidence, they don't have evidence to back these things up, and they want to deflect that the burden of proof is on them, but the burden of proof is on them. Look, they have a monopoly in the schools. They're the only ones to get to teach what they want to teach in the schools. They're making tremendously large claims. They need to have tremendously large support to back up those claims. And so the burden of proof needs to be on them. So this is the way it should go. Evolutionists need to show that mutations in natural selection are sufficient for evolution to occur. The burden of proof is on them. That's one of the reasons that I ask the questions that I ask. And I think in general, that's a very good strategy. We got a lot of students in the room here. I ask you, please, with your teachers, don't be disrespectful to your teachers, right? Don't be rude to them. They're going to say things that are not true. Don't yell at them, don't scream at them, but it is perfectly acceptable for you to be asking them legitimate questions about what they're saying. And how do you know that's true? And how could that possibly have happened? These are perfectly legitimate questions for you to ask. Just do it in a respectful way. Does this work? Yes, it absolutely does. I can tell from my own experience, but also this is an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Times. It was called Testing Darwin's Teachers. And they were bemoaning the fact that students are coming to classes now and asking their teachers scientific questions about evolution. And this is what they said: personal questions can make teachers uncomfortable, but they're fairly easy to deflect. Far tougher are the science-based queries that force teachers to defend a theory they may not ever have studied in depth. So you've got these biology teachers all around the country that are, defending biology in the classroom, not really defending it, they're just presenting it. And when students ask them legitimate scientific questions about what they're saying and how do you know this and what experiment was done to show that, they really struggle with this. And in the article, they made it sound like it was just high school teachers that have problems with this because they're not really up on the current research. The college professors will have just as much trouble as your high school biology teachers will have because they have this big framework and they can see the big picture, but they don't really understand the details at all. Another thing that I do when I'm presenting things is I try to use humor as much as I possibly can. There's a reason for that. I know that when I'm presenting this, I'm not particularly kind towards evolution. I totally believe evolution is wrong. And so I know that there are people that will take offense at that, and they will take it personally. Honestly, they shouldn't, because I'm not trying to attack them personally. But I know that there are some people whose views of themselves is so tied up with this worldview, with this whole belief system that they have, that if you attack it, they're going to feel like they're being personally attacked. And again, that's not my purpose, and I don't think we should do that with our teachers or anything. But some people are going to take it that way. So humor can help in situations like that. And so I wanted to give you an example of that. Thomas Huxley was known as Darwin's bulldog. From everything I've read about Darwin, he was kind of a mild-mannered guy. But he needed a strong defender, and Huxley was the guy. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. He was the guy who sort of defined natural selection as survival of the fittest. And Huxley is also famous for this idea. You've probably heard this. If you give enough typewriters to enough monkeys, eventually one will type the complete works of Shakespeare. Well, some researchers in London decided to sort of test this. I don't think they were completely trying to test it, but what they did is they took a computer keyboard, they put some keyboards in an enclosure that had chimpanzees in it, and they just left them there to see what would happen. And there was an article that was written about it. It was called Monkey See, Monkey Do, and it was published in our paper. And it was fascinating to read. And so I then responded to this by writing a letter to the editor, which I'm going to read to you now. Ever since evolution was first proposed, opponents, and I'm talking about me here, and of course other opponents have argued that the increases in complexity from non-living chemicals to humans are just not possible by evolutionary mechanisms. Evolutionists have been unable to demonstrate any of these increases in complexity in the laboratory, yet they persist in believing that they are possible given billions of years of time. As an illustration of this belief in the miraculous powers of deep time, Thomas Huxley, Darwin's greatest defender, reasoned that monkeys would inadvertently type the complete works of Shakespeare if given enough time. Researchers in England recently put this line of reasoning to the test by giving some monkeys a computer. Complexity did not increase. Instead, chaos ensued. The monkeys preferred to type S's and go to the bathroom on the keyboard. If we extrapolate to 1 billion years, as evolutionists are prone to do, those monkeys would have buried the computer under tons of excrement and would never have typed to be or not to be. There are some things that really are impossible. Monkeys will never type the complete works of Shakespeare. Primordial ooze never did and never will spontaneously generate life. And a bacteria never did and never will evolve into a person. So use humor. Michael Roos wrote a book called Darwinism Defended. He doesn't, I don't think, defend Darwinism very well in this book, but that's my opinion. But in it, he says this: evolution is a fact, fact, fact. Now, we know this is true because he said it 3 times. And the 3rd time, he wrote it in capital letters. So, has to be true. All right, now I wanted to just go on to my last point today, but I have to talk about this because some of you probably saw this in the news this week. Like, this is as current as it gets. On Thursday, Science magazine came out with an article that dealt with this, and then it was all over the internet on Friday. So people even were telling me about it. I had seen it as well. This is the AP article about the article that was in Science, and the AP article was entitled, "Elephants Have Evolved to be Tuskless Because of Ivory Poaching, a Study Finds." So the story is that in Mozambique, in Africa, there was a civil war 20 years ago. And during the civil war, these warring factions were in need of money to get arms. And so one of the easy ways to get money in Mozambique is to kill elephants and cut off the tusks and sell the tusks. So both sides were doing it. It is a shame that people would kill these magnificent animals for a little bit of ivory, but that's what they were doing. And it turns out that there are some female elephants that do not have tusks. The vast majority of the female elephants do have tusks. The males have the big tusks, but the females do have tusks as well. But there was a small minority that did not have tusks. Well, what was happening is they were killing all the elephants they could find with tusks. So they were killing males. They were killing the females with tusks, but the females that didn't have tusks, there was no reason to kill them. So what was happening is that the females that did not have tusks, half of their offspring are females that don't have tusks, and half of their offspring are females that have tusks. They don't actually have male offsprings because those male offsprings, the genetic change that is causing that, actually caused the males to die. So, but half of their offsprings of the female elephants that didn't have tusks, they would not have tusks as well. So what was happening, you're killing all of the female elephants that have tusks, or a lot of them, and so their offspring do have tusks, but you're killing those. So what was happening over time is that the proportion of elephants in the population that didn't have tusks was rising. And that's what this article is about. And of course, they're calling this evolution. This is evolution. It's happening rapidly. You can see it with your eyes. This is proof that evolution is true. Okay, if you read the article, this is in the article, the years of unrest changed the trajectory of evolution in that population, said evolutionary biologist Shane Campbell Staton, based at Princeton University. With colleagues, he set out to understand how the pressure of the ivory trade had tipped the scale of natural selection. Their findings were published Thursday in the journal Science. So this is just this past week. Notice that in this little paragraph here, they're calling it evolution, and then just a few sentences later, they're calling it natural selection. So let me reiterate, natural selection is not evolution. Natural selection prevents evolution from occurring. Natural selection is a weeding out process. It removes things from the population. It never produces anything new. It cannot be the mechanism for evolution, but most people in their mind equate these two ideas. Big mistake, because then what they can do is they say, look, we have an example of natural selection. Don't look at it too closely. Don't think about it too much. Therefore, evolution is true. This has nothing to do with evolution. If you understand genetics, if you understand adaptation, there is a perfectly good explanation for everything that's going on here that absolutely has nothing to do with evolution. Okay? So remember when I was talking about natural selection and why it's not the mechanism for evolution? Do you remember what I told you to do? Every time you hear somebody talk about natural selection, you ask yourself this question: what did we start with and what did we end up with? All right, so what did they start with here? A population of elephants. A few of the female elephants didn't have tusks. Most of them do. What did they end up with? A population of elephants. More of the female elephants didn't have tusks. Less of the female elephants did have tusks. So the only thing that changed was the proportion. There was no change whatsoever in the genetic information that was contained within the population. No change at all. So this does not represent evolution, and it cannot represent evolution. In fact, you could actually argue there was a loss of something. Tusks. Okay. So again, that's the problem that evolution has had from the very start. They can never explain anything new. They can never explain novelty. But they'll use examples like this to convince people who don't read carefully and don't think about it long that, look, clearly evolution is true. How could anybody argue with this? We're seeing it happen before our very eyes. Okay, so final point. My first point in my class was that evolution is unbiblical. My second point was that at least some of the major arguments that are used for evolution are illogical. My third point was, and this is where I spent most of our time, was talking about the fact that the evolution is unscientific. Right? It's not experimental, and there's all kinds of things that are done and said about evolution that are just not scientific. But that's the way it's presented, and that's the way it's always been presented, and so people don't think about the consequences of the arguments that are being made. There is one other point I wanted to talk about, and that is that evolution is hopeless. Before I go on to this, I want to repeat one more time. Evolution is the belief that all living organisms have a single common ancestor, which itself came from non-living matter. That's what this debate is all about. Always keep that in mind. It is not about natural selection. It is about this belief right here. I was showing you some cartoons last week. I saved this one for right now because this is a classic cartoon which makes the classic argument that evolutionists like to make. You will hear this all the time. You've probably had somebody say it to you. We have the facts and you have the faith. And so that's what they're mocking here. Here's this creationist. He is, I don't know why he's always a slightly overweight white guy with a mustache, but okay, he's over there on the right, and he's tipping the scale so that the two things balance, because clearly everything that is important is evidence for evolution. Look over there on the left, and the only thing the creationists have is their cloud of faith hovering up over the balance thing there, right? And honestly, there are people that quite literally believe that this is true. They don't think about it much, and if you think about it, it really begins to break down quickly. I would like us to think about it for a second. Look at that pan on the left. Look at the things that are in that pan. The first thing I see on the left looks like a ladder. That's DNA. Why would DNA be in the evolution pan? If there is one single, probably best scientific argument against evolution, it's DNA. There is no explanation of how it could possibly have come about, and they literally will admit that if you talk to them in detail about this. He's just passed away a few years ago, but there was a very famous American atheist who, just before he died, he announced that he was an agnostic. And that was weird, because he was this hard-boiled atheist his whole life. Now, he's just as lost claiming he's an agnostic as he is claiming he's an atheist, but at the very end of his life, that's what he decided. He announced that he was an agnostic. He wasn't sure if there was a God. The reason that he changed his tune right at the end was DNA. He kept looking at it and said, we have no explanation of how DNA could have evolved. So that's ridiculous that's over there on the left. What else do you see over on the left? Well, look in the back, you'll see fossils. Any unbiased look at the fossil record will tell you that the fossil record does not support evolution, right? It doesn't, and really it's just the biologists that believe that it does. The paleontologists basically know better, but that shouldn't be over there. Why is E equals mc squared over there? It has nothing to do with that. But this is the kind of nonsense statement that all science supports. So, that's science. We have to put it over here. Why is a calculator over there? Again, maybe math, all math supports evolution as well, right? Anything that's intelligent and educated supports evolution. Well, no, they just bundled everything over there, and they're saying everything supports it, and in fact, not true. Now, sometimes you can learn some really profound things by looking at comics. And this one I thought was pretty profound. The little boy on the left, he's the creationist. And the penguin on the right is the evolutionist. And the little boy says, made. And the penguin, the evolutionist says, happened. 'Twas made, just happened. Designed, transpired. On purpose. Accident. I feel it. I know it. Prove it. Easily. There. Exactly. See what they're pointing at? Exact same thing. The facts are not what's in dispute here. The facts are exactly the same for both of us. The observations are exactly the same. In this case, the observations were exactly the same, but they came to exact opposite conclusions. Why was that? Because they had different worldviews. The worldview came first, and then the interpretation of that worldview is what came second. And so when you hear about evolution, that's their interpretation of the facts, but it's not the facts. It's the interpretation of the facts. Now, what exactly is that evolutionary worldview? It's called materialism, and I want to read to you a pretty long quote about this from Richard Lewontin. He said, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life." And then this part right here, "In spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories." He might as well have said evolution right there, because that's what that is. Because we have a prior commitment, what is it? A prior commitment to materialism. Okay? That means that all that there is matter. All there is the physical universe. There's nothing else. That is the presupposition that they work with. He comes right out and says that on this page. "It is not the methods and institutions of science that somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori," that just means our beginning assumptions, a priori adherence to the material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And then the conclusion, "Moreover, that material is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." Wow. He came out and admitted it. We start with the presupposition there is no God, and that's it. So as soon as you say God, we're done. You say creator, we're done. You say, no. They start with this presupposition. They are not going to allow a divine foot in the door. And so he admits they end up with stuff that's counterintuitive. They end up with unsubstantiated just-so stories, but they have to do that because they will not allow the divine foot in the door. Are there any consequences in people's lives when they live like this? Well, of course there are. Okay, let me just show you some examples of that. Because remember, my topic here is evolution is hopeless. There was a letter that was sent in to the editor at the local newspaper, and I think I wasn't 100% sure what the purpose was, but I think the purpose was he was trying to mock creationists. And so his basic idea was, well, if you can create God, so can I. And then he then wrote this letter about the God he would create. So he says this: "In setting my design parameters, I make note of the fact that my creator must be more complex than that which it creates. Aside from this one design constraint, I am literally only limited by my imagination and my perception of reality. I will imagine that my creator is supernatural. Since I have never seen a supernatural entity, I will imagine my creator to be invisible. Nor have I ever heard one, so my creator is silent as well. I've never felt or smelt one either, so my creator will have no substance. I once had a bitter taste in my mouth, but I don't think it was of supernatural origin, so I'll say that my creator is tasteless also." And he just goes on, and he's creating his creator. Now, Genesis tells us that humans were made in the image of God. And ever since that time, humans have been returning the favor. They've been creating God in their own image. And that is exactly what this guy's doing here. If you look carefully, what struck me about the second time I read this through was this: my, I, 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 my. Who is his God? This thing he's creating? Himself. And so that is a consequence of this worldview. The only person I'm answerable to is me. And so I can live the way I want. I will create my God, and he will be just like me. and then he will approve of me because I made him up. Selfishness, too, clearly is an aspect of this. Because again, look, the only person that this person even seems to care about is him and his views. Here's some quotes I read to you early. Man has to understand that he is a mere accident. Man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Are there consequences to people believing these kinds of things? You know, one of the things you probably don't know, but in the Columbine, that was one of the first of the mass murders that occurred in the high schools. Do you know what one of the boys was wearing as he went around shooting people, what he said on his shirt? Natural selection. That's what it said on his shirt. You'll almost never find that in any of the articles that deal with that. But that is what he was wearing on his shirt. I don't know what he thought he was doing, whether he was helping natural selection occur. I don't know what his thought process was. But there are going to be consequences to teaching kids these kinds of things. Richard Dawkins is always good for a quote. And so I found an interview with Richard Dawkins, and he was being interviewed about a lot of different things. But the interview asked him two interesting questions from my perspective. He asked him, what is going to happen to you when you die? And Richard Dawkins says this, of course, it just ends. What else could it do? My thoughts, my feelings, my beliefs, my feelings are all in my brain. My brain is going to rot. So no, there's no question about that. So then the guy asked him another question. Well, if there is a God that you meet after death, what would you say? If I met God in the unlikely event after I died? The first thing I would say is, well, which one are you? Are you Zeus? Are you Thor? Are you Baal? Are you Mithras? Are you Yahweh? Which God are you? And why did you take such great pains to conceal yourself and to hide away from us? That's a curious statement there at the end. Why did you take such great pains to conceal yourself and hide away from us? Remember, Richard Dawkins is the guy who says this. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance have been designed for a purpose. It doesn't sound like God's hiding himself, right? He put his design, and he says so, he put his design obviously and clearly in nature, and Richard Dawkins saw it and sees it. And what does he say? He says it's an illusion. It's a trick of the eyes. It's not there. And then he blames God for hiding himself. God says this in Romans 1:18-20, for what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Now, Richard Dawkins is not satisfied with this affecting his life and how he thinks and how he acts. He wants this to affect you as well. So he is a proselytizer for his perspective and his point of view. He says this is a story that Richard Dawkins tells. I asked my daughter Juliet what she thought wildflowers were for. She gave a rather thoughtful answer. 2 things, she said, to make the world pretty and to help the bees make honey for us. I was touched by this. And sorry I had to tell her that it wasn't true. See what God said in that last passage? He said, I put my understanding in the physical created world, my attributes are clearly seen. And Richard Dawkins' daughter sees it. Look, these things have purpose. There's a reason for these things. And Richard Dawkins has to say, that's nice, but it's not true. It's all an illusion. So he had to correct her. It's sad that people think that they have to pass their misunderstandings and lies on to the next generation, but that's what he's doing. Now, you probably are familiar with Carl Sagan. He was the one who had a program on TV called Cosmos, and he was a committed evolutionist his entire life. Just before he died, he had an interview, and he knew he was dying. He had an interview with Ted Koppel. And Ted Koppel said to him, Dr. Sagan, do you have any pearls of wisdom that you would like to give to the human race? Now, just think for a second. If somebody came to you and you knew you were dying, and they said, do you have any last thoughts? Any things you want to leave for your children, for your grandchildren, for the world in general to think about and ponder, things that would be helpful to us? And so here is the pearls of wisdom that Carl Sagan gave to Ted Koppel before he died. We live on a hunk of rock and metal that circles a humdrum star that is one of 400 billion other stars that make up the Milky Way galaxy, which is one of billions of other galaxies which make up a universe, which may be one of a very large number, perhaps an infinite number of other universes. This is a perspective on human life and our culture that is well worth pondering. I'll translate that. He's saying you are completely and utterly insignificant. Is this going to have, if you buy this, right? If you accept this point of view, is this going to affect how you live your life? Oh, you bet it is, and that's what we're seeing all around us. Romans 1:21 through 22 says this: For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they have become futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they have become fools. Now, I don't want you to leave depressed, because I've read the end of the story, I've read the end of the book, and I know what the conclusion is, and so do you. So let me just end by saying this: man's way leads to an hopeless end, but God's way leads to an endless hope. Just switch that around. And then this made me laugh when I saw this: the Darwin feet are falling off the Darwin fish. The end. Okay. Brian, do you have anything else you want us to do today, or? Are you going to do questions? I'll take some questions if anybody has any questions. Sure. Yes.
So in the curriculum with schools today, how, as parents, since we seem to be getting kind of pushed to the side, how do we help change that?
You're probably not going to be able to change the curriculum. You can get on school boards, and if you've seen all these all these arguments going on at school boards all around the country, it seems like it's like the parents didn't know what the school board people were doing. Well, maybe if you had more parents that were actually involved and active in the school board, they would have more of an effect. Now, are you going to be able to stop this? No, they're still going to be teaching this, but there are some things that you can have, some effect that you can have if you are, in administration in some ways. And I'm not saying school administration, but I'm talking about, I think being involved with the school board is probably a good thing that would be helpful. Not just for this one issue, for other issues as well. And I'm not going to say people should leave the public schools, but that is a conclusion that a lot of people do come to. Right? Any questions? Yes?
Male elephants are still having tusks. They still.
Yes, the male elephants have tusks. The genetic mutation, and that's what is causing this. The genetic mutation actually kills the baby boy elephants that are born without tusks, or that would be born without tusks. I think they die before they're born. But it's these tuskless elephants, female elephants, only have female offspring. And of those, half of them are tusked and half of them are untusked. So the proportion of untusked elephants is increasing, but again, it's only increasing among the female population of the elephants. Yeah. Well, thank you for encouraging me. I've had yes, Brian.
At different times, you've talked about inconsistencies or the presuppositions that go into the dating techniques of rock and all of that. Do you not deal with that anymore?
I can, but it's often the reason that it's not the first thing that I want to necessarily talk about is this. A lot of times when I finish a talk, I can talk about 20 different things, and somebody will say, first question, how old is the earth? I know what they're saying. They are saying, I can't argue against anything you just said because I'm not bringing up anything about what you just said. But given enough time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible becomes probable, and the probable becomes inevitable. And the problem is that argument is bogus from the start. There isn't enough time. So there is not enough time for evolution. At billions of years, there's not enough time for it to occur. I do talk about dating techniques and dating methods, but that is a long, long technical conversation. I will say this, that when you are dating things, Every dating technique has presuppositions built into the dating technique. And it's interesting to me that when people just throw out a number, this was this old or this was this old, if I ask them what are the presuppositions that go into that date, they don't think there's any presuppositions that go into that date. And we sent it to a lab, and the lab told us how old it was. No, they don't understand that there are lots of presuppositions that are built into the whole process. The mathematics behind the dating techniques is fascinating. It's excellent mathematics, and I teach that in my Calc 2 class. But there are also presuppositions, and if you don't accept all the presuppositions to an argument, you don't have to accept the conclusion of the argument. So if you don't even know what the presuppositions are, then how do you know if you agree with the presuppositions? One biologist was having a discussion with me, and I said, can you even tell me what the presuppositions are for strontium rubidium dating? And they were like, I know what they are. And I said, maybe you do, and maybe you don't. Tell me what one of them is, and then I'll know that you know. I know what they are. And then I was pretty sure they didn't. And so I said, why don't you convince me by just giving me one? You don't have to give me all of them. Just give me one of the presuppositions that goes into the dating technique. I know what they are, and they turned and walked away from me. Now, I'm hoping they went back to their desk and went presuppositions of, and Googled it. But it seems like if you're teaching that, you ought to know what the presuppositions are. And most of the time they don't, because they don't care. They just want to say, this is how old this is, and everybody knows it all. That's how old it is. Look, I don't support this view, but there are people that want to demonstrate that this is kind of a quack. And so there are people that have taken something that can be dated, and they've sent it to a laboratory, and they lied about it. When you send something to a laboratory, you don't send it in a vacuum. You have to fill out a form that says, this is where we found it. This is, it was near this riverbed, or this is how deep it was if we dug down. You have to say what other fossils were found around it. You have to make up like a whole story, and they're putting the whole story together, right? And so then they send back a date that fits with the fossils and everything that you said was there. Well, I'm not suggesting someone should do this, but people will take something like that and send it to another laboratory and just give different information. Now, if it's just a matter of doing a test, the date should be the same no matter. Well, they get a very different result from the second laboratory, because now they've put other fossils near it, and they explain that it was found in the different circumstances and so on. So how does that all happen? It's not just a matter of crunching the numbers and coming up with a date. It's not that simple. It's a package, and the package is the whole presuppositions for that package is this view that, that the Earth is this old, and all of your half-lives have not changed, and the speed of light is a constant, and all these presuppositions that are going into these things. So, yeah, it's something that you can talk about, but it is more complicated, and I wouldn't bother talking with somebody unless they were really hung up on that one particular thing. And
I'm asking because I know how, I wanted you to speak to that, because I think a lot of people assume that there's no argument back for that.
oh no, there's great arguments back.
So, where would you tell people to go to get further educated on just even what you're talking about regarding the information on dating techniques?
You could just look up dating techniques and look up, see what the presuppositions are. There's also good articles that have been written and books that have been written about this. But the one dating technique that's interesting to me that everybody has heard of is carbon-14 dating. And what's funny about that is that if there's one dating technique that cannot support evolution, it's carbon-14 dating. And the reason is that you can't date anything to be older than, at most, 50 to 100,000 years old with carbon-14 dating. So you don't get these billions of years with carbon-14 dating. To get to those, you have to do strontium rubidium or uranium lead or potassium argon is a very common one that's used in those circumstances. You are talking about things that have half-lives that are so long, for all practical purposes, they are immeasurable. So if I'm going to say something is billions of years old, the half-life of that substance has to be hundreds of millions of years old. And how would we know what the half-life of something was if its half-life was 250 million years? I mean, you know how they create the half-life, right? I mean, you accurately measure how much you have, you put it on a shelf, you know, you wait 10 years, you come back and you measure it again, and you see how much is decayed. If the half-life is 250 billion years, or 250 million years, how much is decayed in 10 years? Two atoms might have flown off. It's going to have more dust on it than it's going to, right? So what they have to do is they have to speed up the process, and then they have to say, and we know how much we sped the process up by. Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. So again, I'm getting into the details of the whole thing, but I don't really want to do that. I don't want to overwhelm you with things, but I do want to say that there are presuppositions built into all of these things, and you should probably know what they are before you accept the conclusions of these things. It's a good question, Brian. Any other questions? Yes?
A good example to shoot down evolution is Mount St. Helens.
Yeah, Mount St. Helens, when I was at, years ago, I went to the Grand Canyon, and I took a tour around the Grand Canyon, and the bus driver had us get out and do this overlook, and the sun was just about setting, and it was absolutely magnificent. It was beautiful. And she said, "How do you think this formed?" And this little boy said, "A really big flood." And she goes, "No." And I said, "Yes." And, because the argument has always been, this has to be something that would occur gradually over, millions and tens of millions of years. And then Mount St. Helens happened. And Mount St. Helens exploded in 1980. And I actually was out there right after, about 2 months afterwards. And everything was still covered. 2 months later, everything was still covered in dust. And it was just an unbelievable explosion. And almost instantaneously, within like a week, there were canyons that were formed. That if you took somebody to those canyons and said, and they hadn't heard about Mount St. Helens, and you said, "How long would this? Oh, this take millions of years for this to form." It formed in a week, and we saw it happen. So yeah, that is. They were really, really, really surprised by how rapid things can happen if you have cataclysmic change, and so it was an eye-opening experience for a lot of geologists. Yeah.
Helenite, it's called Helenite, I see it advertised, and I think that's a 40-year-old jewel. It'll take millions of years to make that jewel.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but yeah, Jeff's talking about a jewel that was found in the Mount St. Helens explosion site. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you all. You have more questions, come and talk to me, but thank you for your encouragement, and thank you for being part of the class. You're done early.